Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Atlas Project broadcast. We are discussing tonight part 3, chapter 2 of Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. It's called The Utopia of Greed. I'm actually coming to you live from New Orleans, where it's Mardi Gras. We're going to be discussing a very different kind of utopia of greed than the one that's currently happening outside my house. And Greg Salmieri is with me in New York. He'll be joining me in just a second, but I did want to start off with a few announcements, especially if you are joining us for the first time, just happen to be seeing this broadcast coming across your feed on Facebook. The Atlas Project is a live weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group about Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. We decided to launch this project because, well, first of all, it's the 60th anniversary of the book, but also because we wanted to promote the essay contest the Ayn Rand Institute sponsors about the book. Essays for students are due in May, and we end our reading project in the middle of April. So you have a few weeks if you're participating to get an essay ready, and you can win up to $10,000 in the project. In the comments section of this post on the Atlas Shrugged Facebook page, I've included a few links for information about the project if you weren't already aware. First, there's a link to join the Facebook group where weekly online discussions occur. Second, there's a link to past recordings about previous chapters of the book on the Ayn Rand Institute campus website. And last of all, there is a link to ARI's essay contest page where you can see more about what kind of essay contest questions are assigned this year, how much you can win, and details on entering. So that's the first big announcement. The second one that I have is about our next broadcast. Now, we're discussing a chapter tonight that is heavy and thick and deep with significance for the plot of the book and also the philosophical meaning of the story. And we want to keep it to under 2 hours. And we just don't think we can talk about everything there is to discuss in less than 2 hours. And so we are planning to have a supplementary broadcast concerning the very same chapter. Whatever we don't get to tonight, we're going to discuss later this week, Sunday, February 18th. And that'll be happening at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern time. And you can find the broadcast, the same place that you usually do, right here on the Atlas Shrugged Facebook page. I don't know how long that one will go, but because we don't have the same constraints, it's on a weekend, we can really take as much time as we want to, though I don't expect that it would go more than 2 hours either. That was the only other announcement that I had. Greg, do you have anything else you want to add, or do you want to take over at this point?
Well, let me just say this is my favorite chapter in the book, and I'm getting word from some of the other New Yorkers here that it's a favorite of theirs too. I'd just like to take a little bit of time to summarize it before we really jump in, and then Ben, you can tell everyone about the kind of agenda we agreed on, and then we'll get into carrying out that agenda. So, just to recall where we are in the novel, where 2 years in, more than 2 years in to the novel, Dagny crashes on the morning of May 31st in the Valley. And that's at the beginning of Part 3, Chapter 1. And that chapter, the one we looked at last week, Part 3, Chapter 1, takes place all over the course of this first day, right? She arrives in the Valley in the morning, and we just have the whole day. It ends with her going to sleep in Galt's guest room. The chapter we're looking at today, 3.2, picks up the next morning, and it follows her across the whole month of June, which is the month that all of the strikers spend in the Valley for their month of vacation. The first sequence in the chapter is just this first morning when Ragnar comes to breakfast, and we get some interesting reveals there. We get Galt and Dagny deciding on their living arrangements for the month, that he's going to hold her there for the month, that she's going to work as his employee. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The second sequence sets up some of the conflicts Dagny is going to have over the course of the chapter. It tells us about the third and fourth day in the Valley. On the third day, Owen Kellogg gets there, and Dagny learns that the outside world views her as dead. And on the also, we get a little bit of a glimpse into Dagny and Galt's domestic routine. And on the fourth day, Francisco arrives, having himself been in the outside world and thought Dagny was dead. And we get their reunion and some real interesting developments, which we'll have occasion to talk about later. The third sequence concerns Dagny's inner conflict revolving Galt and the choice she has to make about whether to stay in this valley or leave, and just her feelings for him. We're going to talk a lot about that. The fourth sequence I think of as about the valley's culture generally. We get Dagny's discussion with Richard Halley, which is one of the parts that's excerpted in the book For the New Intellectual. We get Dagny's discussion with a young mother who lives in the valley, and we get the scene of the annual reunion of Axton with his three students, at which he includes their wives, for those of them that have them, which is only Kay Ludlow, but also now Dagny included, with only Dagny, Galt, and Axton grasping the significance of that. Sequence 5 is Dagny and Galt's visit to Francisco's copper mine, where there's some very interesting developments in the Galt-Francisco-Dagny love triangle, which we'll talk about. We also have in that sequence a sighting of Reardon's plane, searching for her still, and thoughts about her draw to the world, what's drawing her to the world. And then in the final sequence, chapter 6, we get the conference being held at the end of the month in the valley, where Dagny now has to make her decision, is she going to return to the world or not? And she does decide to return to the world. Galt is going to return with her. Francisco now realizes what's going on between Dagny and Galt, and we have a scene where we get a kind of resolution of a conflict that's been going on between the three of them. And then we get this last scene of Dagny and Galt talking together, their reflections on what it means that she's going back and what this time has meant to her. So that's just an overview of what happens in the chapter, to remind everybody. And Ben, how are we going to go through it?
Yeah, I'll just summarize this really quickly. We're going to do things a little differently tonight than we usually do. Often in the past, we've done it more or less in chronological order of the major scenes of the book. But tonight, because there's so much to discuss, we decided that we were going to front load the episode with the most important stuff first, even though it doesn't necessarily happen first. Actually, a lot of it happens last. And that's because this is the chapter in which Dagny, having been in the valley for about a month, decides to go back to the world. So we're going to discuss her decision and the reasons that she gives for it and the significance of that decision for what's happening at this point in the story. We're then going to talk about the various romantic conflicts that are occurring in the story, how they are resolved, and then we'll spend some time talking about major philosophical issues. If we have time, we may also discuss a few of the things that Greg mentioned, like the nature, the culture of the valley, some certain kinds of sub-themes that are strung throughout this chapter, especially ones related to the title of the chapter, The Utopia of Greed. But we may not get to all of those tonight. And so if you're interested in some of those topics, stay tuned for the supplementary broadcast that we'll be having on Sunday night. But let's first start then with this topic of the major decision of the chapter, Dagny's decision to return to the world. Greg?
Yeah, so first, I'd like to say a little bit about why this is such an important point in the book and such an important chapter. This would be an awful book if she didn't decide to return to the world. There'd be no plot. If as soon as she sees the valley, she was, happy to stay there and everything, then why didn't they just bring her there sooner? I mean, the plot conflict within the book, right, is that she's not ready to go on strike, and the people who are most important to her, or some of them, and now the person who is most important to her, now that she's met Galt, is therefore on the other side of this titanic conflict with her. And it wouldn't be good writing if she accidentally discovered, they've got this hideout, and that was it. Now she's just happy-go-lucky, and she wants to stay there, right? Now, that doesn't mean that, Robert, you were saying the other time how frustrating it is to be with that Dagny's not ready to make the decision, and the people in the valley seem, very patient with her, but you could tell they want her to stay. And it doesn't even mean that it's well written, right? It might be that the author didn't make it compelling that she has reason to want to stay, not want to stay in the valley. And we should think about, from her perspective as a character in the novel, what are her reasons. But from our perspective outside the novel, it's kind of a necessary aspect of the plot construction that she not be ready to go to the valley. She not be ready to stay there. And indeed, if you think about how this book was conceived of, right, Rand conceived of it with the idea, it started from the idea of a strike of the men of the mind. And that led her to, well, then there's got to be a strike leader, and there's got to be the people who he's trying to get on strike, the last holdout. And how dramatic it would be if the last holdout and the strike leader had a personal conflict, if they were in love and so forth, the last scab. And that's what the whole plot revolves around. And the plot has always revolved around that in a way, but we didn't know it until we meet the strike leader and he comes out into the open. Now we have this last third of the novel where what's in a way always been the conflict is now overt and everybody knows that it's a conflict. The readers do and Dagny does. Galt's known it for some time. So here's where, that this conflict is sort of this conflict that comes to the fore in this chapter is really the essence of the conflict of the whole novel. But now, from her perspective, she's not interested, that is, Dagny's not interested in making her life as dramatic and novel-like as possible. From her perspective as a woman in this world, what are her reasons for going back to the world? Why doesn't she stay? Thoughts from our locals? Yeah, Robert?
Well, she keeps repeating that I've tried to live without take a transcontinental. She said that several times in the chapter. So she is not convinced that, first of all, the Taggart Bridge is going to collapse, that all these disasters are going to happen, and her theme, her whole life is that basically whatever harm her brother does, she can always fix it.
Okay.
So she still thinks that.
Good. So she has the reasons that she's always had for wanting to work in the world. James can't do that much trouble, I can fix it, etc. And now she has the added reason of she tried to quit, and it was awful, and she couldn't live without the railroad. We should try to think a bit about. So I see there's a couple other ones. So let's just, while we're right on this point, we should try to think a bit about why is it that she went back the last time. I mean, part of it was that she heard of the tunnel collapse and then she came running back. But how does she hold it? I mean, it's not like she was happy having quit prior to that. So what was the problem with her that made her not able to give it up? Yeah, Mohammed?
If you remember when she did leave the first time, she kept herself busy with all these little projects that they kind of didn't seem to have a uniting purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when she brings this point up, Francisco does counter and say, well, it's not the same thing because you're going to end up actually working the same job that you had. And the section before, they were actually discussing details of building a railroad, but she just can't seem to give up the idea of to give up a whole transcontinental railroad for just building small bridges for.
Yeah, so in some sense she still has the same issue she had in Woodstock. Does anyone see other aspects of that, of having the same issue she had in Woodstock, or maybe in her perspective on the idea of building this railroad in the valley? Ben?
Well, Greg, I can think of one case, and that's the scene later in the chapter where she's visiting Francisco's mines and thinking about the little railroad that she might build for him. I mean, this is related to Mohammed's point, but it's interesting that she has the same kind of issue that comes up there as in Woodstock. What am I doing this for? Where is this line going to go? Now, I think her perspective changes over the course of the chapter somewhat, but.
This is fairly late in her stay in the valley, right? She's 3 weeks in when she's at Francisco's mine. And when she was in Woodstock, right, she had all of these plans on things to build. I could make an orchard, and I could do this, and I could do that. But as she kept on trying to scale up the plans, she would be getting back into the world of Taggart Transcontinental, back into the world where 10289 was law. And she saw the shopkeeper's face, the stolid, lethargic face, as like the limit put on her ambition, right? She couldn't grow beyond the realm of doing something in this tiny hamlet because she'd get out to this shopkeeper and she couldn't deal with her. And I think she still has the same issue. I mean, the valley, she could build a tiny railroad in the valley. But how does she think of the valley? She thinks of it, Robert?
It's small scale, because every innovator she talks to, whether Ellis Wyatt or Midas Mulligan, who has built these grand scale projects, she doesn't get Richard Hawley's music.
Uh-huh.
The whole world is missing your music. No, the ones who I want to hear it can hear it. So she still thinks it's too small a scale.
Yeah, she sees it as a tiny, small-scale thing. They've given up the world, and now they're like camping, in effect. And it's wonderful, and she loves it, and we'll talk about how much it means to her, but it's tiny. She describes in her last conversation with Galt the valley as an underground, right, that she wants to release from its underground. It's bounded by the walls of this valley. Carrie Ann?
There's also another element to why she chooses to leave the valley. And it comes out in part when she sees Hank Rearden's plane circling around. And she realizes it's not Hank Rearden she's drawn to go back to because she knows she can't go back to him as a romantic partner. But she says what's pulling her about him was the vision of Hank Rearden's courage and the courage of all those still fighting to stay alive. So she's assuming that there are lots of people out there who really do want to stay alive, and she's got the talent and the ability and the courage to do it. She can pull it off. She's got a big world out there to help save, and she feels like she'd be betraying that, and she's one of the ones capable of it. And it's her assumption that she's been making since the beginning of the novel that other people want to stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
And she just has to work harder to show that to them, and that she's capable of making that happen.
Mohammed?
Yes, her belief in a world that still wants to stay alive, it comes out when she says, look, we basically won, there are people there, they've seen what these harmful directives do, it's just a matter of time, just a few moments, and they're going to see we're right, and because they really do at the end of the day want to live, and they're going to see that we're right, and that's all the work we really have to put in.
Okay, so we really have two issues here, right? There's she's inspired by the courage of Rearden, by Rearden's dedication to his ideal, to building his world. She doesn't think there are a lot of people like Rearden. She says, he's still looking when everyone else has given up. So it's not like she thinks the whole outside world is like Rearden. But there's Rearden, and there are some other people out there like Rearden, maybe only a few of them. And she thinks she should be that kind of person. She wants to be with that kind of person, and she thinks she ought to be that kind of person, on the one hand. So this isn't everyone's okay. There are these inspiring great people who won't give up a fight that they know is theirs. And then on top of that, there's a view that she has about people at large, which isn't that they're all Hank Reardens, but she does think, how did you put it, Mohammed, that they want to live? Or
they're going to see we're right, and that's, the work's basically done, that they've seen the horrors of whatever economic system was put into place, and now they're just ready to revert back to the century before, however it was.
So they want to live. That's, as she puts it, the uncorrupted remnant of rationality within them, right? So it's not like they're all great that they want to live. There's a lot wrong with a lot of these people, but there's something right about them they want to live, and because of that, they can't continue going wrong indefinitely forever. Not when the right's on their side, their lives depend on recognizing it. We're having Ben's connecting and disconnecting. I'm not sure why. I wanted to go to him once or twice, and he's become a black void. All right, so let me look over the points that we'd want to discuss about this. So this idea that the people in the outside world value their lives, maybe that everybody values their lives, it is is really important. It's really important to Dagny's motivation for going back. How can we tell that this has a special pride of place in her thinking here?
Well, that's the last thing she says to Hugh Axton,
Yeah.
and he asks her to check that premise when she leaves.
Yeah, she says, if you want to know what's taking me back, I'll tell you the reason. That's a pretty strong cue. I had a philosophy class once with Alan Godhelf. It was an introduction to philosophy class, and we were reading The Fountainhead in it. And he had asked something about the character of Dominique's motivation, and people said all kinds of things. And he said, when a character says, the reason that I've done everything I've done in my whole life is because ... you should pay attention. And she does say that. And so here we have Dagny telling us, I'm doing this because I can't, because I think people want to live. That's the uncorrupted remnant of rationality with them. And I can't lose so long as that's true. Yeah. Right? And then Axton agrees that that's kind of a crucial thing, and he thinks she's mistaken, right? So he says, do they? He says it gently. Don't answer me now, right? I know that was the hardest thing for any of us to grasp, but take that back with you as your one premise to check. So we should expect the rest of this novel. We should expect Dagny to be thinking about this over the course of the rest of this novel. Seth online pointed out that, as Robert, you just did, that this is her last premise left to check. So thinks Axton anyway. If Ben were with us, I think he'd point to the fact that there were many earlier intimations in the novel that this is an important point of whether the other people really value their lives. Recall Owen Kellogg asked Dagny if Ivy Starnes was really afterlife. At a few other places, she wondered if self-interest was really Jim's motive, and so forth.
And if yours is the code of life, what is theirs?
Good. And so Francisco tells Reardon that his way of functioning is the code of life. If this other code is opposite to it, what is it? It's not a code of life, then, and we can reflect on what it must be a code of. So we should be looking for developments over the rest of Part 3 in Dagny's thinking on this. We should be looking for developments in whether she we should be looking for her to be checking this premise when she gets back to the world. All right, the couple of other points that I have. In the meantime, I'm trying to see if I can get Ben to return to us, I guess. Well, there he is. He is back. Ben, welcome back.
I switched connections.
All right. You were here the whole time, prevented only by my inability to see. Anyway, so we were talking about the last premise Dagny has to check, but I want to go back and connect that to the other things that we see as reasons why Dagny isn't ready to stay in the valley. Because if this really is the one reason holding her back, then whatever other reasons we see should be connected to it in some way. So the first is that the valley is somehow not enough for her, right? She sees it as small, like something these people are doing on their vacation, but they're not really living. It's an underground. She wants to release it from its underground. Earlier, Will, in a thing from this chapter that you brought up last week, and I too kept on thinking it was in last week's chapter, but it's in this week's chapter, she describes the valley as a prehistorical mirage, right? And then Ragnar says that's how he knows she really is a scab, because one of them would know that it's not the valley, but the outside world is a prehistorical mirage. And this is another take on, she has a different view of the valley than them. So how is this different view of the valley and this view that it would be giving up a lot for a little to build a railroad in the valley, how are these related to this premise that other people value their lives or want to live? Ben, I don't remember if anybody online had thoughts on this issue.
The connection between whether they want to live and her prehistoric mirage view? Can't hear you.
Just the whole prehistoric mirage issue and the view of the valley as little and so forth.
I think somebody may have, referenced that quotation, but not to say anything significant about it. And we had a question last week about the difference between her view of the valley and the residents' view, but we didn't discuss it so much this week.
Does anyone here have thoughts on how these things are related? I mean, I'll just share this. If you, the more, if you think, I mean, one thing that Galt says, right, is you have to premise your values on a view of what's possible. And if you think that the kind of industrial society they have in the outer world at that scale is possible in that world, and for some reason it's just going wrong, and it could maybe be fixed, then you're going to see it as a value to be achieved. But if you think that there's something very wrong at the foundation of it, so that having that kind of society in that kind of having that kind of industrial development in that kind of a society is just not possible, it's just an attempt to fake reality or play out some contradiction, then you're not going to think it's a value, and you're not going to think there's anything to be lost. And so you won't think of the valley as small in comparison to it. You'll think there's nothing out there, and there's something here. Yeah, Robert?
So Dagny's scale is built into the name of the company, transcontinental, from ocean to ocean. So she's always thought on this grand scale, and now all of a sudden she's being kind of pushed to scale that back, all the way, down to a smaller scale. So I think that's a factor in her.
From valley wall to valley wall for now.
For now.
And that would be a hard pill to swallow. Yeah. Mohammed?
The attitude you brought up as whether or not it's actually even possible to build in the outside world. You see that when she talks to the people who are already on strike, so Alice Wyatt and to some extent Richard Halley. When Alice Wyatt says, I make 3 barrels a day or whatever, but what I make is mine, right? Whereas at the outside, it's kind of like you make it and then you're just waiting for it to just completely be taken away from you. So that seems to be the difference. She doesn't seem to get that it's inevitable, given the certain circumstance that exists on the outside, that whatever she does build is going to have to rot. Whereas whatever you do build in the valley, small, whatever, it's still going to be, it can be maintained and it can actually grow, albeit at a limited capacity.
Ben?
I'm not sure if you touched on this at all while I was off for a minute, but I take it that I didn't see anybody bring this point up in the discussion online, but something that occurs to me, at least, about the significance of whether or not people in the outside world want to live is that if all along Dagny has been thinking that as long as they do, then they're gonna recognize the value of what she's doing to some extent, and that connects to what you're just discussing a moment ago, because it ends up having an effect on whether or not her continuing to build is actually possible. I mean, she knows, right? She and Reardon have figured out together this kind of sanction of the victim principle, where she's continuing to, by participating, there are various ways in which she can help them do what they're doing, and do the kind of destructive acts that they're doing. She assumes, though, that they'll only do that, they'll only be evil to a certain extent, in effect, because they still value their lives, and so they won't try to destroy everything.
They'll hit rock bottom, in effect, at some point. And like we say, you have to hit rock bottom and then you rebound. She thinks that's got to happen to the world.
And it's worth thinking about this in relation to the kind of hostage-taking metaphor that we've seen used before. Reardon and Francisco have both said, they're holding us hostages by our love. you think about a kidnapping situation, you always think, well, they're never going to kill the kidnapped victim because that's how they get their ransom, right? And they want to get their ransom. Well, what if they don't? And what if they don't really care about their lives in the end? Then they might kill the victim, and then there's nothing that the victim can do in the world that they're trying to live in.
So a lot of how you view achievement in the outside world, whether you view it as possible, whether you view these things as achievements, depends on your understanding of the people of the outside world and of the culture of the outside world. And if you have a very different view, you're going to have a very different take on it. And it seems like the strikers view the outside world as not yet ready as sort of having gotten something that looks like a civilized technological society before they were ready for it. They have a view of life that's a prehistorical mirage, and we can't deal with that. That is, I don't mean we can't figure out how to handle it. I mean we can't make deals with it. We have to be separate from that, and then insofar as people will come up to our view of the world, we can deal with them. And we need a society that's premised on a different view of life, a view of life that recognizes the role of the mind. And we'll see more about that in Galt's larger speech. But you could see it already in the speech he made on their first night in the Valley. And Mohammed, you said that in the Valley you could at least grow, right? Although your scale of growth is limited. But the strikers don't seem to see their scale of growth as limited, right? I mean, Francisco thinks he's got to pare back to the start, but the start of Danconia Copper is going to be this one mine in Galt, Colorado, USA, and it's going to grow across the whole world. He thinks maybe even within his lifetime it'll be an international company again. But even if it's not, he doesn't know how fast it'll grow. He knows it's more than he had before, and he's looking forward to when it's growing. Ragnar's looking forward to the day when Reardon will be free to earn a profit on Reardon metal. So the strikers think this day is coming. They think they're working towards it. We know from the last chapter they now think the whole strike will succeed very soon, right? When they started, they didn't, but at least they thought now we're finally making progress towards the world we want, rather than, and every day is, further progress towards it, rather than a battle of attrition, which is what they saw life as the outer world as being. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, and also they're seeing, even at the small scale level of growth, even if it remains roughly the same for a while, that's a much greater advance than Dagny solving some transcontinental issue on the outside, because it's on their terms. They get to keep everything, and with people who see the value of what they're doing. So it's the way in which they're doing it. They said they'd rather have, right, was it Ellis Wyatt who says I'd rather have 200 gallons of oil done my way here than limitless supplies on the outside, because it's on their terms, not mine. They want me to live for them. Here I live for me. So it's much more precious.
Yeah, that's right. And the one other aspect we should talk about in connection with the scene where she sees Reardon and she's inspired by his courage, or at least one that occurs to me, Ben, you might have others to bring up, is she doesn't think she'd have a right to the Valley if she gave up on the world of Taggart Transcontinental while she still thought there was a chance to it. And she doesn't think she'd have a right to Galt, which is the other part of this, which we'll talk about in the next section. We move on to talking about Galt. But why is this? Why does anybody, what do people think about this idea?
The people in the Valley are intensely loyal to the values they do have. She could, in her mind, see giving up on Taggart Transcontinental, even though the people in the Valley are literally telling her to do that. She still sees it to herself as giving up on a value, and thus, even if the particular words they're telling her is to leave Taggart Transcontinental, in her mind, in her convictions, it would be a violation of something she loved, something she devoted her life to, and thus not making her worthy enough to join the pantheon of elites that are in the valley.
Yeah, I mean, if she's someone who her attitude is, easy come, easy go. I mean, now it's not going to be like that, but when the going gets tough, I give up on what matters to me. Then she's saying I'm someone who things don't matter to that much. And that's not the kind of person Francisco is, who was willing to go through hell, right, and leave her for 12 years, never knowing if he was going to get her back. Or Galt, who gave up his motor for this struggle and then realized that wasn't going to be the hardest thing he had to give up for. I mean, these are people who are intensely loyal to values. And Nat Taggart and Sebastian d'Anconia, yeah. Nat Taggart, who would not give up the railroad. He was on that bridge, all through the night and so forth. What she's been in love with her whole life is rectitude, right? This loyalty to values, this intense, I'm going to bring my values into reality and fight for them no matter what. And so now it gets tough. She doesn't see why she has to give up these values, but just, some friends are telling her to, and they're on the wrong side of it. And she's just going to give up. What then would happen if Galt or the Valley came under attack? Would she just give up on that too? She would be undermining her whole capacity as a value achiever to give up on this, which is basically giving up on the whole world from her perspective, if she thought it was savable. And if she thought that, as she put it, Ben, how did she ask it? Like, are the terms of the battle such that I can wish to win? There's in this scene, if she's, could she be sure that the terms of the battle were such that she could no longer wish to win? If she didn't have that, she would have no right to the Valley if she left Taggart, gave up on Taggart Transcontinental. Well, I don't think we need to find the quote, unless you've got it right on hand.
Yeah, actually, I just found it.
Okay, go ahead.
They were right. They were right, the men of Atlantis. They were right to vanish if they knew that they left no value behind them. But until and unless she saw that no chance was untaken and no battle unfought, she had no right to remain among them. Is that the passage you were thinking of?
Yeah, that's what I had in mind. Yeah. So, are there any other aspects of the choice you want to talk about? Bring up.
I was going to just throw in there that I'm looking to see if it's worth mentioning something somebody else has brought up. But you mentioned at the beginning that this is a dramatic chapter, that it would be boring without this kind of conflict. But that, of course, Dagny isn't trying to make her life dramatic. And I think that I agree with that in principle, but at the same time, the way that you just pitched your point made it sound a little bit like there's something about the battle itself that Dagny needs. And of course, we've also seen that in her romantic relationships, where she needs to have a kind of adversarial relationship with her lover. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, she's not trying to make her life tightly plotted, but she does recognize that life involves effort, involves struggle. She expects there to be difficulty, right? And she does romanticize and valorize that. And I think, I mean, that's part of both the romantic encounters, but it's part of her whole view of life, right? Nat Taggart was somebody who fought great odds, fought the whole world and won. Hank Rearden is somebody like that, and John Galt is like that more than anyone. Ben's, just as you online will have seen, gone black on us again. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Ben's back. Good. So Ben, let's talk a little bit about that last conversation between Dagny and Galt. We'll talk about the romantic side of the conversation later, but we get some more on her perspective and how it's alike and different from her coming back from Woodstock in this conversation. Because this is where she's remembering what she said, looking at the fog-bound image of Atlantis, right? Where she's talking to the man at the end of the railroad tracks, you who I've never known, and so forth. Her self-dedication of unrequited love. now she's reliving that moment this time with Galt, and it makes sense because this is now she's decided to go back to the world as she did again. But what's the same and what's different? First, thoughts on this from the room? Or any online? Ben, I'm looking at what's online through the Facebook method you and I talked about, but it's updating very slowly. So you need to be the minder of what people are saying to us.
Yeah, I've been looking in both places. Nothing to share right now.
Okay.
The difference is he's physically there.
Okay.
I mean, when she was in her bedroom a month ago, he was an ideal, but not an actual. And now he's actual, and she's seen what he's all about.
So it's not just he that's an ideal, but that was an ideal and is now real. It's also his world, right?
Right.
Atlantis is real. You've seen the Atlantis they were looking for, he said, right? What about in her attitude?
Differences in her attitude, Greg, do you mean?
Yeah, or similarities, but differences are more interesting, I guess.
Well, I have some thoughts on this unless anybody else in the room does.
Go ahead, Ben.
Well, so you and I had a discussion earlier about how much and whether she changes in this chapter, and especially in relation to the fog-bound sinking city Atlantis imagery. And my initial view going into my latest reading was that she hadn't changed that much, that there wasn't a big difference between her view going into the valley and her view going out, because after all, I mean, she does decide to go back, and she also quotes, these same lines from when she was thinking about Atlantis, which have this implication of an unattainable ideal, although she qualifies each of them and interrupts, herself in presenting them. But in conversation with you and then further examination of the text myself, I realized there's a little bit more of a change going on here. And I think it's even possible to pinpoint where it happens. And I think that you said that you still don't quite agree with me about this, but we'll have to see what happens. But I mean, up until very recently, up until, almost close to the end of the chapter, she's, still been seeing these residents of the valley as giving up significant values, as late as page 794, where she's in the mine scene. She's at the mine scene with Francisco. She's saying, the scene we talked about before, where give up a transcontinental railroad for just a little tiny mine line. But at the same time, she's been gradually throughout the chapter taking more and more pleasure in her time there. There's all these different scenes where there's just pleasure taken in very simple actions, like cooking breakfast and seeing Galt eat and solving the puzzle of how she would build the railroad mine and everything. And she's even starting to see how the outside world's view of morality especially has influenced her own thinking. And you see that especially where she's expecting Galt to sacrifice his love for Dagny and, for the sake of Francisco. And it's really only once she sees that he doesn't, or at least the way that I read it, that she starts to get a different view of things. And as soon as she sees that he says, no, I'm having you stay in my apartment, not Francisco's, you see her feel this sudden flood of relief. And then she realizes that whatever she decides, whether she's going to stay in the valley or go back to the world, that she suddenly sees either path flooded by this unchanging sunlight. And because she's seen Galt as this kind of firm, unchanging character, she sees people in the valley as people that she can deal with as clear and firm as sun and rocks, which is a completely different attitude from what she had when she was in Woodstock, when she was encountering other people, that she had a kind of anxiety dealing with people, but in nature, everything was fixed and could be understood. And here it seems like people can be understood, just like the rest of nature. as opposed to the world outside. And she's functioning well in an emergency. She thinks about herself in the third person.
Large, I agree with that, and I agree that the scene at the mine is very significant, and we definitely want to talk more about that. The part I'm still resistant to is, I mean, in your notes on this, and even a little bit in the way you described it just now, you get the sense of the valley is growing on her, or she's coming, and that's the part I'm resistant to. I mean, on her second morning in the valley, right, she accepts this job offer from Galt. Or she makes the job, and she says, "This is what I want," and he says, "Is that what you want?" And she says, "That is what I want," and has to stop herself from saying more than anything, on earth. And when she opens her eyes, this is what she's always wanted. So in some sense, I think the Valley and Galt struck her immediately and fully as this is what I want out of life. There was no room for it to grow on her. It was perfect from the beginning. At least as a symbol of a type of way of life. If something's growing on her, it's the idea that we actually could do it here alone in this valley. But even that, right, she doesn't fully believe. And then in the moment when Galt makes that decision, right, it's not that the valley now seems better to her than it did, but rather the worry that he'd make the other decision threatened to take away what it had meant to her. So it's not like now she learned that it is a certain way and she didn't think before. She had thought it was a certain way, then it got like a worry of it being compromised occurred. And then when she saw that, no, Galt really is what he is and the valley really is what it is, then I agree. It takes on this new security to her or something, whereby then I agree with what you said.
It seems like what's really happening is that it's becoming clearer to her what the choice is and what the contrast between the valley and the rest of the world is. Because it really does mean what it looked like it meant, as you mentioned before, and Galt really is the person he claims to be. So it's not that the valley is an illusion in her mind, but also this is having the effect of making her realize that there is less to lose by giving up the outside world than she might have thought. And I mean, I think you see that especially in that passage where she's saying whichever one she chooses, the world is flooded by sunlight. And that includes if she chooses staying in the valley. Now, she hasn't decided to do that yet.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's I lost the strain of what I was going to think, but Carrie Ann, did you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, I think I want to follow up and press some of what Ben's drawing our attention to. I get the sense, not just that she wants the security of knowing that Galt is who he is, she's also testing the reality of the ideal, because she doesn't fully believe it, in a sense. And because of that, the way that this last conversation with Galt, he accuses her, without using the word, of being quixotic, right? When you go out to fight and you're choosing to take this unnecessary burden, this struggle of yours, don't end up becoming like the people who are questing for something that they really don't think is possible, right? He reminds her at the end that it's real, it's possible, it's yours, and she's not, I think, layered on to these other motivations for going to the outside world is that she doesn't think that the ideal really is achievable, even though she has yearned all her life to reach it, in a sense. That there's a tinge of the quixotic here.
But except that she says, now maybe she's not right, or maybe she's not consistent about this, right? But she says she can't lose in her battle, that she thinks she's going to win. And I think that's a really big difference from when she's looking down at Atlantis, right? When she's looking down at Atlantis from her apartment building, she thinks she's going to lose, and she's resigned to fighting this Byronic battle to be worthy of galt, or the galt system, but she's never actually going to achieve it. Now she thinks she's going to win, and she acknowledges the possibility that she won't win, but she thinks she's going to win. She thinks she can win, and so it's less Byronic. I don't know if it's less quixotic than it was before. She's not resigned to failure, and I think that's a big difference. The other part, though, there's another thing, Ben, in what you said that I also really agree with. I do agree that galt thinks, right, she's fighting it for a doomed kind of thing. You can't really win this way, and there's a risk of compromising your worldview if you do this. So he does say that, right? But anyway, she says, I started my life with this one basic conviction that the world was mine to shape in the images of my highest values and never to be surrendered to a lesser standard. From her perspective, to stay in the valley would be to surrender it to a lesser standard, because the image of her highest value is the valley, but a whole world like this valley. And so I'm going out to fight for that. A Taggart transcontinental-sized world, ocean to ocean of this valley, right? I'm going out to fight for that, to release this valley from its underground, rather than surrender it to a lesser standard. Oh, we'll have it in a valley, or if I learn that it's impossible, okay.
And and Greg, this is an issue that is found in lots of Rand's fiction, where the protagonist realizes that they have the chance that they might lose everything, related to some concrete goal of theirs. Rourke in The Fountainhead realizes he might not succeed as an architect. Kira in We Living realizes she might not get out of Soviet Russia, but both of them in their own way, and I don't want to give away too much about those other books, find ways of coming to terms with that possibility where, regardless of what happens, the pain is only going to go down to a certain point, which is the way that Rourke thinks about it. And they still are being good soldiers, which is the way that Kira thinks about it. And they still live in a universe where so much is possible.
Yeah. And so this is how Dagny thinks about it, even in her worst moment of the self-dedication to unrequited love. The other thing that you said, Ben, that I think was right is, I forget what word you used, but the word it triggered in my mind a few minutes ago was articulating. I mean, she gets this kind of image all at once of what the valley is and what Atlantis is and what galt is. Right, but when she sees him and when she has that first tour around, but part of what's happening over the course of this time is she's kind of making it clear and explicit to herself in words. She's understanding what she experienced as a kind of sum as she looked around at it, and the philosophical principles that are behind it and are behind the way of life that she's witnessing there, which we'll get to in due course. But I think a lot of what's happening over the course of this chapter, and that happens in that scene where Galt says, has it ever occurred to you, Miss Taggart, that after her test of him, it's what struck her as as a sum integrated by her emotions is becoming, articulate, and she's coming to understand it. And I think that's also part of what's happening with her decision to go back. I mean, she always a part of what's been leading her to work in this world. Part of what's been leading her to work in this world is the view that people value their lives and therefore will be reachable eventually. But that was not something that was made explicit before. And now it is made explicit. And now she can bring it back with her as her one premise left to check. And because it's been made explicit, and also because she has the fuel of seeing what her ideal would look like realized and knowing that it is realizable, at least in this valley, and so why not on a grand scale, she's able to come back to the world reinvigorated and believing that she can be successful.
If anything I said earlier suggested that, you've done a very good job making it explicit and articulating it.
You said something about how it at first seems to her, and then she's able to learn more what that amounts to.
Okay.
All right, well, this happens sometimes. People see different things in what the other said than they do. So let's turn to the subject of the romantic relationships. Unless, Ben, is there anything you want us to touch on that we haven't yet before we go to that?
Shouldn't we at least say something about the advice that Galt gives her?
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I thought you had more to say on this, but he gives her, this the paragraph that we used in our promo video about, if you come to think that your highest values are not to be attained and greatest vision is not to be made real, don't damn this earth, don't damn existence. You've seen it, and then it ends, of course, with the famous line that we'll see at least one more place in this book. It's real, it's possible, it's yours. Though I think it's interesting that just before that, and we also use this in the promo, remember that you can reach it whenever you choose to see. Remember that it will be waiting and that it's real, it's possible, it's yours. And there's a lot in this chapter and in the previous chapter about seeing. I mean, we talked last week about how Dagny notices that Galt, it looks like sight is Galt's best loved faculty, and throughout that chapter he's making her look at things and that she doesn't necessarily want to look at, and the residents of the valley are saying, no, it's important that you see things for yourself when you decide to come here. And even earlier when we were talking about the last premise to check, about how the last premise to check was whether or not the people in the outside world value their lives, that came up because Dagny had said that she couldn't believe that people were blind or would want to be blind. She can't believe men can refuse to see that they remain blind and deaf to us forever when their truth is ours and their lives depend on accepting it. They still love their lives. So she's connecting the idea of loving your life with wanting to see, and then they challenge whether they want to see. So they challenge whether they want to live. So that maybe has implications for whether they want to see as well. And Galt is reminding her here that she needs to be sure to see things for what they are too.
Yeah, I mean, our decision to use this this passage for the promo, right, reflects what I was saying at the beginning of today, that I think this is the chapter where the conflict of the book really comes into focus. I mean, it's been there all along, but now it's Galt versus Dagny, who's right about this, and about what the path is to achieving her ideals. And this exchange between them, we really get that. They each have this vision, and she thinks it's achievable one way and he another, and she'll have to see which one of them is wrong, as Galt puts it earlier. I do think the choose to see language is interesting, because it would suggest that Dagny could just make a certain choice and then have the knowledge that she doesn't have yet. But I don't think either Galt or Dagny thinks exactly that, right? That there's just a choice Dagny has to make, and then she can see it. There's something she can't see yet. But it's interesting that Galt sometimes puts it as choose to see.
She may get to a point where she finds out something new that she doesn't know now, and at that point, it may be a question of how does she process that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's right. Let's turn now to the relationships. So, context we already have on this from the last chapter, right? Dagny and Galt are in love. I mean, they're not using the word love, but they're in love. And Dagny is in love with Galt in a way she has not been with anyone else, right? This is it for her. We've got every reason to think that, right? Everything she's always thought possible, now he's the promise, image of the promise, and so forth. And they both know it and know that the other knows it. Or anyway, know that the other knows there's something really serious between them. How do we know that? I mean, there's all kinds of intimations, right? Galt says at the end of the last chapter, he knows what either choice means, right? Whether she chooses to stay or chooses to go as fully as she does. But of course, they're on opposite sides of this central conflict. So that's the kind of context that we already have on this from the last chapter, and this is what gets developed in this chapter, right? Galt decides that they're going to spend the month together in the valley. That Dagny, she wakes up on the second morning, just doesn't have any thoughts as to how long she's going to be here. Galt says, "I'm going to hold you here for a month." She asks to work as his servant rather than let her room and board be paid for from Ragnar's money, or rather from her money that Ragnar's stolen back for her. No, the relevance of this is, I think, why there's this no giving rule that's raised in the previous chapter, and where Mulligan can't give his car to Galt as a courtesy. He has to rent it for 25 cents a day. It's not that people in the valley never give each other anything. Francisco gives Galt and Dagny a glass of wine, and Galt gives her a cigarette. But it's so I take it that the don't give anything isn't like, we don't invite someone to stay over our house for the night. That's fine. But we don't, let someone live rent-free for months and give them our car for, a week. There's some scale at which this rule kicks in, the scale at which it would normally be an economic transaction. In any case, because of this rule, she needs money, and this is the setup for she's going to work for Galt. The situation gets more complicated, right, when Kellogg arrives and she learns the outside world thinks she's dead. She asks at that point if she could send a message to the outside world, right? And she asks it for what reason? Why does she want to send a message? Yeah.
Presumably for Reardon to know she's alive and she can't bear the thought of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reardon's the only person she's worried about in the world, and she's just heard from Owen Kellogg, who spoke to Reardon, right? So it's basically, can she tell Reardon? And she asks Galt, do you, allow for communication? And he says no. Do you want to ask for a special exception? So what do people make of her not asking for one?
Francisco does the same thing, by the way.
Yes, Francisco also asks if they can make an exception, but we'll get to him in a moment. Yeah, Earl?
Well, I think she'd be indebted.
She'd be indebted to Galt.
Right.
So that's the reason for not doing it.
One of them.
Additional or alternative reasons people want to?
She's decided she's not going to stay with Hank, so he's got to get used to the idea that she's not going to be.
But not used to the idea that she's dead.
I mean, she's decided she's not going to stay with him. I think that's right. But, that hardly seems like,
Yeah.
sorry, honey, for letting you think I was dead for a month, but I decided we should break up.
Him, right? Like she calls him like she's still with him.
Uh-huh.
So she's, bringing him on to a situation that isn't real. So she's, by not calling him.
It would be leading him on to send. Why couldn't she send a note saying, Hank, I'm alive, but it's over? In nicer.
Text.
Don't try to call me.
Yeah.
I suppose that's an option.
The relationship between Galt and Dagny takes the form of kind of like this game or contest, and she just doesn't want to ask for an exception because that would mean she just can't live by the rules he set. So that's how I kind of take that.
Yeah, what would it mean for her to be asking for an exception? Yeah, Ben.
Lena in the chat says she might not want Galt to know she was with Hank. Now, of course, Galt does know she was, but she doesn't know that he knows that. And there's even a passage to that effect. Rather, it was a comment someone made, not a passage. But that asking for that exception would deliver to Galt the idea that she had a very special interest in Reardon. In another novel, she describes love as exception making.
That's exactly how I think of it. The love is exception making point. She's asking Galt to break a rule. It's doubtful that Galt would do it, right? But she knows how important the strike and its principles and so forth are to Galt. Probably he wouldn't bend anyway. But to make the case to him that he should bend or should give an exception, she'd have to say, plead the kind of supreme importance of Reardon to her. And that's something she's not prepared to do and not prepared to ask for from Galt. And of course, she doesn't even want Galt to know about Reardon, or she doesn't think he does know. If he does know, are we still pretending we don't know that we're not? We gave up on pretending that we haven't figured out that Galt's the worker last week. So he knows because he's the worker, but if we didn't know he was the worker, then we wouldn't know he knows.
And Greg, if you're right about that, then that also makes sense of why Francisco is considering asking for the same exception, because there's basically a love triangle between Dagny and Francisco for the sake of Reardon. It's a weird love triangle, but your mic.
Oh, sorry. Francisco definitely asks when he gets there for the same thing, right? Asks to make the exception out of regard for Reardon, and we can see this. He's thinking about how he just spent the last few days. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And then he gets this, oh my God, there's someone who's not my worst enemy, but one of my best friends who's going through exactly this. Galt denies the exception in that case, right? But the reason he gives is, do you want to give anybody in the outside world any relief from the consequences of remaining out there? And Francisco says no. And then Galt says, pity, Francisco, right? Now, Francisco is supremely pitiless. We've seen in other scenes. Reardon thought he was, merciless, but he knew he couldn't match anything like what this guy does when he causes a stock market crash right in front of him. But, of course, Francisco has made exceptions for Reardon before. And, Galt is not willing to do that. Dagny, of course, fears, and this gets us to one of our next topics, that he might make an exception for Francisco. But, it is cruel. But it's a cruelty that is maybe has a purpose, you say. It's a war type, all sharing love and war type situation.
But then it's interesting that Francisco also says pity John at the end, and John answers firmly no while looking at Dagny. And Pooja online was wondering about why exactly that was, and my suspicion is that it's just that even though Francisco is John's friend, John is, as Dagny has noticed, so firm in his values that he knows what he wants. He wants Dagny, and he just doesn't even begin to have pity, even for his best friend on this kind of question. What do you think?
Yeah, so John says, you've given up the most for this strike, or you've suffered the most for this strike, right? And Francisco sort of let me know, what do you mean? And then pity John, right? And John's looking at Dagny when he says it. So clearly what he means is he's had to give up Dagny for the strike. And John knows in a way that Francisco might not, that he's not going to get her back. First of all, it's not clear that Galt knows that Francisco knows about Reardon. We don't know.
It's clear he doesn't because they did not communicate.
Right.
Until
we don't know if they've had any contact, but it seems like Galt has had no contact with Francisco since he sent him up there. So probably, and even if they have talked, Francisco is really private about this kind of stuff. I don't think he would have said. So Galt probably doesn't know that Francisco knows he's not going to get her back, even about Reardon, much less does he know that Galt's going to take her away.
If this were a comedy, it would be an Oscar Wilde play, given how many levels of knowing and knowing that people know and not knowing that they know are involved in it. And Al, by the way, points out in the chat, this is not technically a love triangle, but now it's a love quadrangle because Galt is now involved in it.
Yeah, I mean,
And you
there's
could
also
actually expand that
Ed,
to include others. Yeah, pentangle, pentagon.
yeah. So, but Galt knows that Francisco's given up Dagny and that he's going to lose her. He doesn't know if Francisco knows that, but that's what he's saying when he says you've given up the most or suffered the most. And when Francisco knows that Galt knows something of this, he knows how hard it's been. He knows what he looked like suffering over looking for Daphne's plane, and so he asks to pity John, and John says no. And the firmness is, though Francisco doesn't know it, John, I'm going to take her, right? Now, the question that we got, I think what Pooja was asking about it, is how does this square with Dagny's worry that he might give her up for Francisco? Hasn't he already said, I'm not going to give her up for Francisco in that moment? But let's, before we talk about that, backtrack a moment to, so Francisco comes in, he comes to Galt's house. Daphne's not immediately to be seen because she's in her room mending one of Galt's shirts, and she has the door closed, so she doesn't want him to see that she's not so good at it yet. She could hear the concern in Galt's voice. He says, I've got a scab here, and you've got to... So Francisco runs into the room. He is immediately on his knees and shocked. Dagny notices that Galt closes the door to leave them alone, which is interesting, right? And then what goes on in this encounter? He says, of course I love you, and were you frightened when he made me say it, and so forth. And so at this point, Francisco's accepted that he's, and this is a favorite scene of mine, I should say. He's most of my favorite scenes in the novel are in this chapter, but Francisco's accepted that Dagny is now with Reardon. And it's so much that and he's happy, right? What do people make of this?
Yeah. So, what it's not, what some people might see it as, it's not him getting over his love for her in the sense that he does admit, well, a lot of people don't admit in similar situations that does he still love her? Yes. And will he be forever jealous of the person or, of the person who ends up having her? Yes, he admits that. That's something a bit different than what a lot of people do in this similar situation, which is, I never really liked you at all, or, I never really...
he's not playing it cool.
Right, he's not, he's being honest. He's being honest. He's saying, look, I see why, how you can't possibly return to me after what happened, but also I still feel the same way that I felt before.
Do people find his acceptance of the affair and his happiness despite it believable?
Yes.
Will
Because
says yeah.
you never really stop loving someone, not if it meant anything.
And in addition to that, when the person hasn't changed, it's not like she degenerated morally. She's still the deeply admirable Dagny that she always was. So it's not that there were grounds to lose esteem for her, right? So, but also he's relieved that she's not dead, right? One of his highest values is still alive, and he's just so relieved that she's still alive to be in his life and to be a source of value as a friend.
Yeah, I think her not being dead matters. I mean, now he's Francisco, and I think a good person in love with a good person who makes another choice, but for reasons you could understand. This is how I would want to act in this situation. I think it is believable. It's something, it can be difficult, but I don't think if you just had recently learned that, the woman you love was in love with someone else and was going to be with them, or thought you would learn that, you'd be deliriously happy and relieved, and it would be just a wonderful day for you. That aspect of it, that the other stuff doesn't matter at all, is he thought she was dead, right? And that gives a lot of perspective when someone turns out to be dead. And that's why he has the look of what she felt when she arrived in the valley. Yeah.
Another relevant point here is that Francisco has been away from Dagny for 12 years, right? And must have accepted a long time ago that that he was pursuing a course of action that was going to take him away from her, and maybe irreconcilably. Now, it did maybe sort of look to him like he might get her back, when he came to see her at Woodstock. But even still, that was a pretty dicey thing to assume.
It was a short-lived thing because that night she's with Reardon.
And speaking of Reardon, the bigger question about how realistic it is that somebody could have this kind of serenity, finding that someone else is no longer in love with you, or at least is no longer able to be with you romantically. A better test is going to be Reardon when he finds out the same thing about Dagny. And we know she's going back now, and we know that Reardon's still back there. So what's going to happen with him? And if his reaction is similar, go ahead.
We know Reardon's in the same boat in a way as Francisco, because Reardon is flying around looking for her corpse. So he's had a month of what Francisco had a couple of days of. So that too will be part of Reardon's context when we get to him.
It's also important, though, I think, to think about how there's ways in which the characters in this novel have very stylized and idealized psychologies that are purified in a way that you don't see in everyday life. And for better or for worse. I'm not just talking about the better characters. You in someone like James Taggart is has a degree of self-consciousness about his wickedness that you don't expect even real evil people have. And I would think that's in keeping with the kind of literary genre that Rand is writing in, that she magnifies and essentializes things, including, the form of the reaction that somebody's having to a certain kind of event like this.
Yeah, the other thing that Francisco's happy about is he could finally tell her what he's done these past 12 years, which he had not been able to do. Mm-hmm. And so she has not seen him at his best until just now, that this is the man he was always wanted to be. And he did salute Sebastian Van Cornwall by the way he lived.
Yeah, that's really true, really important. So he is getting a form of the reunion with Dagny he always wanted. Mm-hmm. It's not, his first choice form of it, but it is a form of what he's wanted. He's created her world for her. She can see it now. Oh, you're still a scab. Well, that doesn't matter. You'll be one of us because you always were one of us. And this is what I always am. Oh, those women, you didn't believe that, right? I think you've always known it, and so forth. Another part of this...
And people do this in real life, too. This is not, to push back against my own earlier point about the literary convention, which I think is still true in principle. People do reconcile themselves to this kind of thing. You've ask yourself if you ever had a breakup where you maybe didn't realize at the time that you were going to get over it and still respect the person. And I think I have, and I have been in good relationships with exes, not quite the same degree at stake here as
I think in context how Francisco responds to this makes a lot of sense. And I had wanted to say I was going to react to a comment that Betsy made in the previous chat, which is that Francisco knows Dagny still loves him. And I think that's important. And I think one of the things that's so admirable about Francisco in this scene is the amount of perspective and vulnerability, the amount of perspective he has on what's going on, including his feelings and hers, such that he is able to, with full confidence, say sorts of things that, people would normally think of as making them very vulnerable to say, like, look, I know you love me. He can see that and tell that that's the case, even in this situation, which... and is comfortable saying it and even insisting on it when she doesn't realize it and letting her see that, where you'd expect that to be her role to say, oh, I do still love you, Francisco, in a way, but a different way than this. He's the one who has that, is more in control of himself in that way. And I think that's part of what stands out to me as admirable about Francisco in this situation. Okay, so let's move on, as Daphne has, from Francisco to Galt, with some stops in between. And why is Galt? I mean, do people have a sense? Does anyone want to talk about why Galt is her final choice? What's different about him than the others? That this is the man she wants? Yeah, Mohammed.
Well, first of all, I can say why clearly it's not Reardon that's the final choice, because I don't think they would be a ordinary match if the world outside was not so just disorganized, because I don't think they really share, at least initially, the same outlook on relationships and sex, and you can tell by the way he ends up with Lillian that it's a bit different. But as far as Francisco versus Galt, only Galt is the one mentioned as the person at the end of the railroad, the type of being she's been trying to understand since early on. Whereas Francisco he was also off her radar for 12 years as a potential partner, so that kind of plays in.
Yeah. So Ben's returning to us, but I'm also seeing we're getting some notifications about the connection being slow. Now it's coming back to normal. Okay, so yeah, so whether Reardon and she would be well suited in other circumstances is something let's talk about next week when we get to see Reardon again. There's the idea that we get in this chapter the idea that her feelings for Francisco always had a kind of like in token of the future, not a full present tense thing. Maybe they would have developed into that had she and he been together for all this time, but she and he haven't been together for all this time, right? And so it didn't develop in the way that it might have. And what she has with Francisco is still a childhood type connection for Francisco. And you could even see that in Francisco's feelings for her, right? Francisco's always talking about the kind of child she was. What I created is the world you always wanted. Like, when we looked out at the huts, across the huts into New York, when we were like 12. And he talks about, what I couldn't deliver to the looters, I had to fight to create a world that would be different from the looters' world because I couldn't let you be delivered to the kind of fate you would have had in that world. I couldn't do it for any child who looked at the world the way you did, right? So there's, even Francisco's perspective on Daphne is of a childhood romance. Now, he wanted to reclaim it as an adult, but it's very much tied to we grew up together, we had our start together, and so forth. So that's part of it. What else, Robert?
Well, there's also one other aspect earlier in the valley when Dagny is jealous that Galt might be with somebody. When he goes out every other night to get physics.
Right.
Is he with the fish wife or what?
Where's he getting physical?
So there's that side conflict, but Galt is the ideal, as Mohammed said. I mean, he's the ideal, and the world of Atlas Shrugged, it makes sense. It totally makes sense that as they're first seen together, as you said earlier tonight, that's kind of the sum of it. That just looking at each other, they knew that.
Carrie Ann?
What that was.
Yeah, I think that's right, but there's also a little something else layered on there, because when she just looks at him, like in this one of these last beholdings of him, the way in which she describes him is kind of like the way in which other men have seen her. So there's a style of his way of being that matches hers, right? Francisco he has a mirthfulness or merriment, and Hank has an austerity, but there's the way in which, so I was just struck by, she's looking at his face that had been in the sunlight at the moment when she'd first seen it, a face of merciless serenity, unflinching perceptiveness without pain or fear or guilt. She's looking at the planes and lines. There's a matter-of-factness about him. And it's kind of like the way that Hank Reardon had described what she looked like when she was in her job as a transcontinental railroad operator, and the way in which Galt describes when he first saw her. She was wearing an evening gown, but she was down there giving orders and fixing stuff. And the way in which she's described is very similar to the way in which he's described. It's like their styles match, in a sense. So there's a magnetism because of their styles too.
Yeah, and Galt seems to see that. I mean, his description of it is very interesting. But yeah, so Carrie Ann, you were talking about how the character of Galt is described. How Galt is described as in ways similar to how Dagny is described from the perspectives of Reardon and Galt when they talk about first seeing her. I think there's a lot to that, and I think if we wanted to take time over it, more than I think we can, we could look into the details of those descriptions. Galt himself says, right, that she had an air of combining, I forget exactly what the items are. If you have it on hand, you could read it out. But combining sort of luxury and enjoyment of life with the kind of energy and the things that are their source. And that he's the first man who has ever stated in what manner those things were inseparable. So that's kind of his take on part of what's natural. Do you have that line on hand? Okay, so the conflict issues with Galt. Dagny is worried. I mean, there are a few things, right? All right, so we've talked about why Galt is Dagny's final choice. We've talked a little bit about Galt's actions already with respect to Dagny. He's chosen to hold her in the valley for a month. He's chosen not to let her contact Reardon. He's chosen to deny that petition when Francisco makes it. He's chosen to make things difficult for her by showing her precisely what he's done, right, that he is the destroyer, by reminding her of that at every moment, by really throwing in her face the kind of conflict that's between them, and also letting her know that she knows the full stakes of it. Towards the end of the chapter, well, I mean, she doesn't want him to let her stay with Francisco, but making the choice she wants, but also not letting her pretend that the situation is other than as it is. We have the issue of her jealousy, which Robert raised. Part of what I find interesting here is the scene where she's in bed thinking of him. And we have both of them acknowledging that they want the other, that they can't have the other now in different ways. But the intensity of that scene where she's lying at night, she's capable of just walking in there. She has to stop herself from doing it. She experiences it as an overwhelming desire to have him, even at the price of her convictions, even at the price of her life and of his. She remembers that she would have shot the destroyer on sight if he showed himself before, but she still wishes he did because she would have shot him, but not before. So, I mean, this goes to, we were talking about, this goes to, in a way, carry on the discussion you and I had where we were, when we were doing the broadcast on romance in the novel, of there's a way that you can look at sex as, it's just sex, and then what's the foil or the opposite to that? And one way you were putting the opposite to that at one point, which we agree that it's opposite to Dagny's view that, it's just sex, it's just some casual thing, or is with a relationship focus, right? You're looking for a kind of person you could have a relationship with. And I was sort of uncomfortable with putting it that way, although one way we could mean it, I would be comfortable with it. And, what she wants is a meeting with his soul, right? So, but she's also, at least in this moment, if I slept with him and then killed him, it would have been better than not having done it. And even if I died, so it's not like it's like, the picket fence and a 401k. And she's not relationship focused in that sense. And part of her doesn't even think she's relationship focused in the sense of she thinks it's just a body I can't control. But then the other part of her knows, right, that that's not true. That if he wasn't what he is and she wasn't what she was, her body wouldn't bring her to this. So I guess I'm reiterating my agreement and disagree, depending on how we take the relationship-focused aspect of it. It's what she wants is his body because of who he is and because of who she is and because of what that spiritual meeting would mean to them. But she experiences it as just a desire to have sex with him, and even at all costs.
Greg?
Thoughts on this? And I was saying that I'm impressed with how Dagny experiences it as an intense and overwhelming physical desire that feels like it's just her body, right? Even though she knows at another level that her body wouldn't bring her to this. And I was raising some issues about connecting it to some of what Carrie Ann and I had been going back and forth over on a previous broadcast. So Carrie Ann, did you have any thoughts on this? Just because I was breaking up what we talked about before.
Not at the moment, so.
Okay. I just felt bad about, reiterating my response to something you said in the past and not getting your present views on it.
You said she's not really thinking of it in terms of a relationship, but it's been lurking and she finally names it as a wife.
Yes.
That's a
good.
Lifelong commitment. This is something she's been looking forward to
Mhm.
in some sense, and she hadn't found it, and now she knows this is the man.
Yeah.
If that doesn't mean relationship, I don't know what does, in the
And that's-
most robust sense of the word.
And that's part of what's so striking about it, right? Because at some points in this chapter, and they're not, all at the beginning and all at the end, it's, look, he'd come here if I was going to die tomorrow. So let me die tomorrow, and we'll do it tonight, or if I would have found him in the past. So, but then at the other point, Axton, in this, I think, really beautiful scene, treats her as Galt's wife, and she then accepts that title and then thinks, I have been his wife in every sense except that one. And of course, she thinks that she will be his wife if she stays, right? So there's a really striking duality to what's going on with her. And I think there's a sense in which the desire for him is experienced as self-sufficient and unrelated to the desire for like a long-term commitment from him, or not stemming from it. And yet, at the other hand, he's the first man with whom she's wanted this kind of commitment, right? This kind of relationship.
Is that really true? I mean, obviously she's writing a novel, so she wants to make the plot right. But she could have married Francisco if, before the whole strike thing had started. How would that have been? Obviously, she didn't make that conflict in the story, and if Hank had been divorced, say he said, I'm getting rid of Lillian, I want to marry Dagny, the whole thing would have been very complicated, right?
I don't think she would have married Hank. The relationship, as far as it went, was just this type of. She called herself his mistress. I mean,
Which is also the word she used for Francisco.
Francisco.
yeah. So I don't think she. Neither of them, I think. Plus, Francisco left at a time when there was no reason to think she was thinking about marriage. She left that early.
I mean,
I think her.
yeah, it's a little hard because women would have been thinking about marriage in the
16 years
50s,
old.
but early. It's not like, no one gets married till they're 30. And but anyway, Dagny didn't seem to have been thinking about marriage.
Well,
in
clearly,
the story.
Francisco is a person she could have married. I mean, he has all these wonderful qualities.
In a different history, maybe. And yet
But I don't get the impression that she's even thinking about marriage with him.
Mhm.
And she doesn't, even consider what he's up to the times when she isn't with him.
But she does talk about the pain she had when he kind of disappeared and how it hurt her for years.
Well, she loved.
And
she
she
loved.
finally, it was just so much pain, she finally just pushed it out of herself. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing when she's with Hank and when she meets John. She's already decided, oh my God, I've had so much pain with this guy, I can't, I'm not even thinking about this anymore. But before the strike, I mean, clearly there was a very strong attachment. Certainly they could have.
I mean, I think her relationship with Francisco could have, in an alternate history, developed in a different line where they might have ended up together. but they would have each grown differently in that version of the story, and their relationship would have grown differently. And the relationship they have is one that's all about a future. And it's arrested at the relationship of very young people projecting their lives together in a future that, they're building on that past, but they don't have a continuous relationship, and they don't have a grown-up romantic relationship, in effect, that has to do with what they've each been through. And they could maybe form one, and if there wasn't a Galt or a Reardon in the world, maybe they would. Of course, if there wasn't a Galt in the world, there wouldn't have been a strike in the, so it's hard to say. So Dagny comes to worry that Galt would give her up for Francisco. Why does she come to worry this? And she comes to worry that Francisco won't be able to handle it when she realizes it's Galt that she wants to end up with, not Reardon. Which would be harder, presumably, for Francisco, because Galt is the one that Francisco looked to,
So clearly they were thinking about it.
for support.
It's not like it wasn't on her mind.
No, but I mean, Galt is the one that Francisco imagined to gain support when he found out about Reardon.
Dagny was thinking about how it's going to affect Francisco.
Yeah.
She's totally aware, that he could have been somebody that she would marry.
Well, he's aware that he wants her, and anyway. Ben, now that you're back with us, there's some issues of how we should proceed at this point. Where are we? We're almost at 9 anyway.
I
Ben,
think we
you're
should try
muted.
to wrap up and
Yeah. So we've
we
got
should,
about,
leave the philosophical stuff for the supplemental.
I agree. So we've got about 8 minutes till 9. Let's take that 8 minutes to finish talking about the relationship stuff, and we'll leave everything else for the supplemental. Okay, so this is a question of why did Galt give Francisco the chance? Right? One of the things that worries Dagny is that Galt sent Francisco to her at Woodstock rather than coming himself. He said, if you want your chance, take it. Francisco doesn't understand why he said that. He asks Galt. Galt won't say. Do you mind if I don't tell you now? Then Dagny, and you gave him a chance you wanted. This furthers her worry that maybe Galt would step aside for Francisco. Why does he do this? Robert?
Well, he does want Francisco to have every chance available to him, but also he's still not sure that she is ready. And because the sight of his face, she could not walk right past. I mean, they've established that once she saw him, even in the outside world, it would be life-changing. But if she's not ready yet, then that might end up like where they are now. That if she's not ready to go out on strike, it'll just change the whole dynamic of what they're aiming for.
Yeah, it's an interesting feature, and this, I think, is a feature of a fictional universe, that Galt could have this certainty that, she'd fall in love with him at first sight, basically. So maybe that's why. Maybe it's that Galt isn't sure she's ready to go on strike. Other reasons?
I think he asked Francisco to go on strike with him, and he knew this was going to be something he would have to give up. And I think he felt that he asked him to make this sacrifice, and he would have felt that he had to give him a chance to recover that. That's my opinion.
That he owed, what's going on here? Internet connection restored, but I've been streaming this whole time. All right, sorry. The computer gods are being odd. Yeah, so he thought he maybe owed it to Francisco because he knew Francisco gave her up for the strike. I mean, suppose Francisco had recruited her and she had come back from Woodstock to the Valley. What do you imagine would have been the plot, the trajectory of the story from there?
He kissed her and she responded to him in Woodstock. So that would have changed the whole novel, basically.
Still, she would have met Galt.
Yeah.
She would have presumably had the same
Greg?
chemistry going on.
Ben, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, it would be a very different story, and it wouldn't be maybe the one that we like as much as this one. But my thought on why he gives Francisco the chance is for the same reason that Francisco accepts what happens, which is that if Dagny had chosen Francisco instead of Galt, even though she really wanted Galt, then that wouldn't have been what Francisco wanted for the reasons that we discussed previously. And by the same token, if Dagny had chosen Francisco and really wanted it, then Galt wouldn't have wanted her to choose him for some other reason. And so it's like he's doing a little scientific experiment. He's holding all things constant. It's, allowing her to make a choice, right? In the best possible situation, which is where Galt's not there, and she's got time to think about it. And does she really want Francisco? And no, she doesn't, even under that circumstance.
Suppose she had, though. I mean, suppose she's more ready to go on strike than it turns out she was when Francisco arrives at the cabin. Suppose they do more than kiss. They get back together in a more serious way. She comes back to the Valley. Then she meets Galt. What would have happened then? Would Galt have stood aside and let her be with Francisco? Would she have wanted Galt instead? Might she have moved? We don't know. I think we don't know what would have happened.
She would have been a different person if she had done that. And that's why we don't know what would have happened.
I mean, it's not the case that if she was with Francisco, she couldn't, Galt might not have stolen her away from Francisco later. We don't know what would have happened. She would have had to have been different to want different things. But I think Galt didn't want to be with her unless she preferred to be with him from Francisco. And that she met Francisco, that Francisco was the one to tell her about the strike rather than him, wasn't going to change that. She was either going to be ready or not ready to go on strike when Francisco told her. She was either going to want to get back together or not want to get back together with Francisco then. And if she did reunite with Francisco, it was either going to be a permanent thing, like now she's ready to marry Francisco and she wants to be with him forever, or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, then, Galt's still in the world in the future. So, I mean, the idea that, he's the one who gets there 15 minutes before Francisco, or Francisco, so she'll be with that one. I mean, that's not how love works. And I don't think Galt thinks it is. So, and Francisco was owed the chance at that reunion and to see if she still wanted to be with him. But I don't think. Anyway, so that's. I don't think her going on strike or her even reconnecting with Francisco sexually would have been the end of Galt thinking there's any possibility. We'd have to see what things were like then when she met Galt. So now there's the test, and let that be our last topic. Francisco asks Dagny, will you come stay with me for the week, just as friends, and we won't see each other, I just want to spend more time with you. Dagny tries to make Galt's question to answer rather than her own. Galt doesn't let her do that, right? I won't hold you to it, and until she says, well, I want you to make the decision, and admits that that's what's going on. And then he says, no, you'll stay with me. Francisco takes it as just, Galt's very stern, and he's the sternest of teachers, and of course, if Galt, you can't make her stay, no one can, and so forth. And then Galt and she have this discussion about it where, you had to put me to a test to wonder if I'd fall to the lowest level of altruism. And as Ben, as you pointed out earlier, this, reaffirms or saves the valley in her eyes, makes it clear to her that it was what she thought it was. And it's also the launching point for one of the really central philosophical, or the centerpiece theme for one of the really central philosophical messages of the chapter, which is Galt's view that there are no conflicts of interest. And we're at 9 now, where there are need be no conflicts of interest, let's say rather. We're at 9 now, so let's end there, and we'll pick up on that on Sunday.
Greg, can I just end by
please.
by mentioning the passage from the chapter that I want to talk about more on Sunday, because I think it connects to the title of the chapter and a number of these themes that we're going to be addressing. And that's this one where Dagny and Francisco and Galt all hold the Dagny and Francisco hold up the goblets and give a toast. And she says, "But I have not earned it, and what you've paid, I'm paying now. And I don't know whether I'll ever earn enough to hold clear title. But if hell is the price and the measure, then let me be the greediest of the three of us." So why is Dagny the greediest of the three of them? What does greed mean in this chapter? The chapter is called the Utopia of Greed. It's clearly a different kind of greed than what people are used to talking about. So this is one of the big things we're going to discuss on Sunday.
Just on that scene, well, first, Carrie Ann points out, and actually sheepish about having pointed out, that it's Galt and Dagny who have the goblets, right? Because Francisco gives what would have been his goblet to Dagny, indicating that it's Dagny and Galt who have the story of Sebastian d'Ancona and his wife, and that it's indeed Galt that's the one that's been through the most. And then we have this scene, of course, where Dagny says, "Let me be the greediest." And we do need to talk about that on Sunday. There's also just in that scene, right, we get Francisco accepting now the relationship with Galt and seeing it as inherent in the strike. And that is also, I think, a really striking scene in line with the scene where where he first talks to her in the valley, and he's accepting of the relationship with Francisco. And I don't know if people have thoughts on either of these scenes. Let's create a thing on the Facebook where people can post on thoughts about the romantic resolutions, and we can take up those topics also as part of the supplemental broadcast on Sunday. Anything people say about it?
Okay.
And with that, thanks everyone, and sorry for all the difficulties today, and we'll join you again on Sunday. Then I'll be broadcasting from my apartment where the internet is stellar, so hopefully we'll have gigabit speeds and no problems. I don't know why today was so crummy. All right, thanks everyone.
Good night, and laissez les bon temps brûler.